Good morning and welcome to Broadband Mapping. Didn't mean to wake anybody up there. Sorry. No, I'd like to welcome you. Our presenters today are Jeff Searle. On the far right, he's Director of the NC Broadband Infrastructure Office. And Ben Shelton, my colleague at the Center for Geographic Information Analysis. He's a GIS project manager. I want to remind you that you can follow the presentations on your app, on your device, and capture slides if you wish. The session is being recorded, so you'll be able to see it later. Okay.
Morning. It's kind of early, so it's good to see everyone here. Sort of like that 8 o'clock class in college, right? By about the end of the semester, there's only a handful of people that show up, but this is like a pretty good crowd. Big room though, so I'd encourage you to spread out. Oh, I see you already are. Okay, so we'll use the microphone. Again, my name is Jeff Searle. I'm the director of the North Carolina Broadband Infrastructure Office. We're a division of the North Carolina Department of Information Technology, so we are a state agency. We're actually a sister division with the CGIA folks. And work closely with them. Actually, we are neighbors too, because we sit on the same floor in the same building, share the same cubicles, and get awfully chummy and close, which is good for the reasons I'll get into here. So our office is a small office. We're about 8 folks, and we do broadband planning, high-speed internet access planning for the state. Policy, and we have a technical assistance team comprised of 5 folks. We have carved the state up into thirds and have a point of contact for the east, central, and western parts of the state. These folks are all steeped in the telecommunications business and have decades of experience in that business, and they primarily help communities, counties, and other nonprofits with high-speed internet deployment within their areas. So, for example, a lot of folks are coming forward and saying, "Listen, we need either broadband or high-speed internet access out into the county areas where there's deficient coverage or deployment of infrastructure." Or we're looking at some economic development or maybe some educational applications. How do we go about doing that? And a lot of folks, typically what you do is you would call the cable company or the telephone company, and they'd say, "No, I don't serve you," and that's the end of the conversation. So we try to further that conversation by helping the communities plan, and we also know the language and know the business model, so we can sit down and be that. In between and go between the communities and the providers and say, hey, how do we get better broadband for this community? We also have a grant program. Last session, the North Carolina General Assembly authorized a $10 million rural broadband grant program. And we're in the middle of administering that. We'll get into that a little bit and why it's significant to our mapping initiatives. And one of the things that's important about that, along with the federal funding opportunities that internet service providers have, is that typically all of these programs are focused on funding in unserved areas. Well, what are unserved areas? We don't necessarily have a clear or uniform definition across the country, but finding unserved areas depends on mapping. And we have to locate certain areas and certain geographic areas where there's deficient coverage. So typically, the FCC breaks down those geographic areas by census blocks, and they have internet service providers report by census block what they're serving, the speeds that they're serving, the technology that they're using, and that's all very useful and helpful to us. And we work with Ben and CGIA to map that. The FCC puts out its maps, and some other entities do some mapping, but we found that at the state level, it's very helpful to our planners to map that information, and then it's helpful when we're looking at grant programs and funding opportunities. So we we'll get into a little bit of the mapping, and Ben will explain to you how we're going about the mapping and the deficiencies behind the reporting and the methodology that the Federal Communications Commission reports on and its maps, and how we're trying to find different data sets and be a little bit creative about locating where the key infrastructure is in the state. And how we should go about mapping that. The grant program will come into play because we're requesting specific location data from the internet service providers on where they're serving or where they would like to serve. There's federal programs that are now reporting specific data, so actual addresses and we can see by satellite if we can pinpoint the address or geolocate the location, we can actually count within census blocks who has and who doesn't have. And then we'll also talk a little bit about some of we subscribe to commercial services that also help us with actual like fiber runs. Where are these, companies and providers deploying their fiber optic networks? Where's the middle mile, what we call middle mile, which is kind of the go-between between the big pipes that get you to the internet and what we call the last mile, which is the wire from or to your home. So that's all very important to us as we look at planning and funding. And I'll turn it over to Ben. He'll explain a little bit more detail about. I'm sorry. I didn't actually tell you about our office. So I did get into a few of these things. Technical assistance team, again, I mentioned them, and we also put together, which interestingly enough, a community planning playbook, which has gotten a lot of attention. It's online. Communities can go in there. We provide actual tools and resources like RFPs if the community wants to issue an RFP to recruit providers in. We have checklists for inventory or infrastructure assessments. A lot of the counties don't have a lot of resources, but they may have, a county manager, utilities department. They know some of the basics, so they can go in and use our checklist and go out and look for vertical assets, map those vertical assets, whether it's a water tower or maybe another radio tower that the school's using or maybe public safety is using. So we found that that's very popular with folks. And then just another thing, the speed reporting tool, which is very important to us. So in addition to all these other data sets that we're collecting, we created, with Ben's help, a speed reporting tool where citizens can go into the map, they can put in their address, and they can find out based on what the Federal Communications Commission reporting is telling them is available in their area. And if they say, no, that's not available, or, hey, I can't get that from my provider, they simply either click a box or they fill in their address. They take a speed test that's we're linked to Ookla. And then that comes back and it's reported back to us. We have a map on the back end where that data goes, and then we can see actual locations where people are having problems. So we've had about 4,500 entries statewide. We've have some spots where we're seeing clusters, which is very helpful to us because that shows us a trend. So we can tell our technical assistance guys to go into that area and do a deeper dive. So that's where the map is becoming incredibly helpful. I talked about our program. We issued the Connecting North Carolina, the state broadband plan, about 3 years ago, and we're working through that plan. It has about 80 recommendations. We met with probably 24 groups and individuals, experts in the area, both national and statewide, and conducted a survey of over 3,500 local officials to get at the recommendations that are contained in the report. Many of them are being followed and carried out now. One of them was a rural broadband grant program, which the General Assembly authorized last session. And then I think you'll hear some exciting announcements coming out of the governor's office in the coming days, maybe even as close as today. The plan does... basically what the plan does is it seeks ways to remove barriers either at the state level or within the private sector to facilitate the deployment of broadband infrastructure. So that's the main crux of the plan. Then we break it down into different issue areas because not only is the access to the infrastructure a problem, but adoption is. Whether you're going to subscribe to the internet service and use the internet service, we have a huge problem in North Carolina with that. The biggest barrier, based on a study we've done, NC Light Up, that's on our website, is and based on studies done by, for example, Pew Charitable Trust, is cost. So affordability. Can folks afford the service that's offered to them? And so we tackle that. One of the biggest chapters and one of the big problems that we hear about statewide is what we call the homework gap, which is number 3 there. Homework gap is K through 12 students who don't have sufficient internet access at home to complete a homework assignment. So nationally, we see that about 7 in 10 teachers are now assigning homework to students that requires them to go onto the internet. Statewide, we've seen, we just did a pilot survey where we now partnered with a national survey group, and will complete a survey in the coming weeks that goes out to all the teachers, students, and parents at every single school around the state. And we hope to gather more data from that to show where we have problems. But we figure anywhere between 10 and 15% of all K through 12 students do not have sufficient access at home to complete homework assignments. It's probably the single biggest issue we hear about statewide. And so we have a chapter in the plan and some policies promoting that. So I'll turn it over to Ben, but here's what he's mapped as far as what fixed deployment. By fixed, we mean terrestrial, either by wire or by wireless, not mobile, cellular, not satellite. So excluding those two, and he'll get into kind of why we've structured the maps this way and where we go from here. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Well, as Jeff mentioned, one of the primary data sets that we utilize is derived from the Federal Communications Commission. And what they do is they have all the providers report their services per census block across the state. It's reported as a CSV file that then we're able to use, take those census block numbers and map against the census data so that we can kind of come up with these statewide pictures that you see here for a lot of different data that's inside that CSV file that they provide. So one of the primary things is, we use speed thresholds for certain things, and one of the main ones that we use is 25 megabytes per second download and 3 megabytes per second upload, and that's kind of a minimum service threshold that we feel is adequate for, like what he said, a lot of the initiatives for like the homework gap and things. So the areas in green here are shown that they have at least 25 megabytes per second and 3 megabytes per second upload speeds across the state. So as you can see, there's a lot of gaps and areas in there that don't have this service area. Another data set that we can kind of look at from that CSV file is kind of the technologies that are being deployed at each location. So as you can see, we kind of can map and look at what's going on at the ground level, what kind of technologies are being deployed, what's being utilized, whether it's fiber or fixed wireless, DSL, cable, and then kind of correlate that to the speeds that we're seeing and seeing some trends there. But what we're really trying to drive down to with all this mapping is kind of the areas in between. What's either has no broadband service or has less than that speed threshold. So at what we consider as underserved areas. And as you can see, based on the FCC data, there's over 250,000 households that have underserved broadband service. So that's quite widespread. But there's one caveat with the FCC data is that we're pretty sure that it's underestimating quite a few areas across the state. So you can identify these areas that in the FCC data don't have this service level, but there's a lot of gaps that we're trying to fill and get a little more granular data to see how many underserved areas there are. Here's a quick example of kind of the deficiencies in the FCC data. So as you can see, the pink lines there that you can kind of see on the screen, those are census blocks. And so that census block in the middle might be reported in the CSV file as having gigabyte speeds throughout that census block by one provider. But when you look at on the ground what's going on, the areas in green really have the gigabyte speeds, and there's a lot of areas in that census block that might not have that kind of service or no service at all. So, those houses down there in the south, they're being underrepresented in that FCC data because they're just reporting, if they have one household in that census block, they can report that whole census block as being served at that level and with that technology. But in reality, when you're on the ground, things don't line up to the census blocks. So what we're trying to do is get a little more granular with the data and try to supplement the FCC data so that we can get a little better picture on what's going on. And one of those ways that we do it, he mentioned that we have the speed reporting tool. If you go to the Broadband Infrastructure Office's website, you can get to the speed reporting tool. Anybody can use this. Enter in your information, whether you have service or not. If you do have service, there's a link to a speed test website that you can kind of check your download and upload speeds, enter in your address, and it'll geocode that information and put it into our database. So, if you have some local initiatives going on or broadband efforts at your own organization, we recommend anybody going and putting in their information. The more entries we have, the more better picture we have what's going on around the state and where those gaps are. And, we've worked with local COGs. This is one we did with the Land of Sky COG that, they wanted to do the same kind of speed reporting tool, but with a little more information, a little more detail. And that GeoForm tool that we use isn't as flexible. So what we did was we went into Survey 123 and we implemented the same kind of standard 4 or 5 questions that we have in the main speed reporting tool, but with a lot of other supplemental information based on, the price people are willing to pay, whether it's a home business, whether they would have a home business if they had better service and things like that. But then we take the common fields from this tool and we aggregate it back on the back end with a scheduled task that kind of aggregates all of those data points from both surveys and gets it into one database so that we can kind of then really get a clear look and do some heat mapping and cluster analysis to see, well, the orange areas are where it's saying we have over 25 megabytes per second speed. And, the hot spots there are maybe areas that are saying that they have 25 megabytes per second, but really in reality on the ground they don't. So then we can kind of drive things to where those clusters are. And Jeff mentioned the great grant program. So its effort was, there's some criteria in the legislation that we had to abide by for identifying areas that are eligible for that grant program. And mapping played a big part into putting together an ArcGIS Online map that they can then drill down to these eligible areas and verify those grant applications that they're receiving from the providers. So, it had to be a Commerce Tier 1 county. So those are those blue counties there. Those are the eligible counties for the grant program. We also had to verify whether that area was receiving federal funds already. And if it was, we weren't able to use the grant program for that. So what we have here is the Cost America Fund grant program that the federal government does. We have their data and where they've deployed and funded areas, and we can analyze that into this map at a parcel by parcel level. So even if one census block is reporting less than 10:1 speed, which is the criteria for the grant, you can kind of see if the grant program for the federal government served some of the areas in that block, but not all of the areas. And if there are remaining areas in that same census block, then we can drive funds to those areas. A couple minutes. So as you can see, what we're doing, we're trying to map the whole state, but we're also trying to take local looks at, where the FCC data can be supplemented with other efforts, and either the community service reporting or the great grant program, they're providing data, and we're trying to just take all the data we can get to get a little more granular look at what's going on at these local areas. We have some cooperative efforts with NCDOT on some grant programs that they have going on and incorporating broadband technology in those grants. We've also subscribed to 2 commercial services to get some additional data. Those commercial services have actual fiber locations. It's proprietary information, but it's hit and miss what providers are participating in those commercial services. So it might still not be a full look at the entire state in all providers. It's only the providers that are participating. And we're also partnering with the NTIA folks at the federal level to kind of work on sharing data and supplementing what the federal government already provides. Anything else you want to add? All right, well, we have a few minutes if anybody has any questions. Yes.
Do you know if the areas that were struggling with connections, was it due to economic reasons or was it due to physical limitations of geography?
I think,
Repeat the question.
yeah, he was asking whether the areas that were underserved are underserved due to physical limitations or financial restrictions or the geography.
Yeah. It's a little bit of both, and it's sort of circular. I mean, one kind of begets the other. So, for example, in some parts of the eastern North Carolina, where you see the old tobacco farms and industry has left some of those areas, you can overlay the economically stressed counties map on top of ours, and you get a pretty similar picture as far as who's in trouble. Typically, those areas are served by incumbent providers that just don't either have the capital or there's not a business case for them to upgrade their networks to something like a fiber network. If you recall the map, the multicolored map that had the technologies displayed in the yellow areas, you see a lot of fiber in some of our rural areas, which you may find surprising. Up in the northwest there, and then spotted throughout. Most of those are telephone cooperatives that receive federal funding. There's a couple of smaller regional companies that also receive some federal funding to build out. They were able to take those, match some funds, and that's, I think, what it's going to take. It's going to take additional capital, whether it's coming through federal grant programs, private equity, or state grant programs.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Fascinating subject, by the way. Great presentation. I really enjoyed that. So you said that the matching grants up in the high country area explains the higher amount of fiber up there. Is there any reason why that particular area of the state received that type of matching funds when there are other areas of the state that don't have the same economic scale that they do that did not receive that?
Typically, what you see is some of those co-ops had legacy copper systems, or DSL, what they call DSL systems, so the old copper telephone lines. And typically, they were in areas that were remote or rural, and the grant programs that helped them were for remote or rural areas. So there was typically through United States Department of Agriculture, and they have a threshold for who their applicants could be, a population threshold, in other words. So that's primarily why. And I should say or clarify that this is all to the home. So this doesn't signify the middle mile fiber infrastructure that these providers may have, or the long haul. We're fairly fiber rich state in a sense. Because we have a middle mile network called MCNC. If you're not familiar with it, it's a research and education network that serves all of our K through 12 schools, community colleges, universities, and some healthcare providers. We're one of the first states in the nation to connect all K through 12 schools to fiber. We also sit in between Boston and Miami, and we get a lot of the long haul guys through here, like L3. And some of the other big pipes out west, we have Apple, Facebook, and Google that all have large data centers in our state. So we have a lot of infrastructure. The problem that we're having is last mile connectivity to the home.
I know you're responsible for North Carolina because that's what we're here for. Do you know if other southeastern states are trying to do as much as you are with their state networks?
Yeah.
The reason I ask is because my family lives in a different state.
So the question is, are other states in the Southeast doing as much as we are to improve their broadband infrastructure or their health? And reaching out to the citizens. They all want to be like us, of course. But there are more and more efforts across the country. In fact, and I think within the last year, 7 states have created broadband infrastructure offices similar to ours. Several created grant programs. The newest ones, Tennessee created a grant program 2 years ago. I asked them, how did you guys get a grant program? I've been after one for 3 years. And they said, well, we just said, look at all the great things North Carolina's doing, and we're a competitor. We got to catch up. And so then I went back and said, look at what Tennessee has. Look at all the, and they've got a grant program. We don't. Georgia, South Carolina's had an initiative that's been ongoing, but it's more of a through a national program. And Virginia's got a very strong initiative. So yeah, the Southeast states have really stepped up all their efforts. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, we're out of time. Actually, look for Ben.
We'll stay around. If you want to ask questions, we'll be here.
For Ben Shelton and Jeff Searle. Let's thank them for a great presentation.
Thank you. Thanks.